Well, thank you to all of you for having stayed through the day. And there is just so much to learn and absorb about this topic of digital trust that each one of us, whether we've been on the stage or in your chairs, are still beginning to learn the different dimensions of it and various issues as they relate to the technologies that we enjoy, that we love, and immerse in today. But now, as we go out this evening, our focus is turning to some technology and technology applications that are around the corner. And that takes us to the metaverse. And I have a terrific panel here, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about the metaverse and its implications for digital trust and how some of those implications are probably work in progress, just like the metaverse. So collectively, we can learn and potentially even contribute to the putty, as it were, as continues to take hold. So we have, I think you got the identities of everybody right here, but just to kind of reiterate, we have Clara from Meta. She's the head of public policy in Singapore and ASEAN. Associate Professor Daniel Song from the law faculty of NUS, and 𝗦𝗬𝗲𝗏𝗍, who's director development of data-driven tech at IMDA. So welcome to all of you. Clara, perhaps we can lead off with you, since you are with Meta, and Meta is taking the lead on the metaverse. And so if you could help us understand where the metaverse departs from the experiences that we take for granted today. What are some of the differences that you see would be the most significant ones to put a spotlight on as we then start exploring what the opportunities for digital trust, or maybe the lack thereof, might be?
Sounds good. Thank you, Dr. Bhaskar. And yes, thank you everybody for spending time. It's the last panel of the day, and really excited to have a conversation with my fellow panelists. So what do we expect, right? What is the big departure between today and the metaverse? I think, so our founder, Mark Zuckerberg, has talked about the metaverse as the next evolution of the internet and social connection, right? It's about interconnected spaces in the virtual world and that feeling of presence. And so in many ways, it is like, being inside of the internet. And a key sort of defining factor is that sense of presence, such that you can be with someone else virtually, in that virtual space, but feel that you're there, very, very close and interacting, very, very real, that spatial sort of, distribution of people and things. But you could be, miles apart, different countries. So I think that's one of the key sort of defining, features for that. I think to render that sort of social, presence in the virtual space requires, things like, sensors, right? That not only capture your external environment in high definition, but it's also the internal sort of like sensors, right? To be able to capture your facial expression, your body movements. Because right now, when you go into the metaverse, when I put on my Quest headset and go into Horizon Worlds, we still look a little bit cartoonish. But I think in the future, when we try and, we move towards more advances and more sort of lifelike, renders, right, in the metaverse for social presence, then we will need to, yes, have these captured in greater detail and rendered into your avatars. And as you've heard, soon avatars will have legs, right, in the metaverse and Horizon Worlds. And so then you're capturing sort of, not only hand movements, but also bodily movements. So these are all sort of the new and defining things that I think the metaverse will bring. Meta is just one company. There are many other companies that will be putting together the different parts of sort of the metaverse. And I think we believe that this is, a future that we can build together. We've changed our company name because we believe in the economic opportunity that it can bring. 3 trillion is what we projected for global GDP, in the next sort of 20 years. And for APAC alone, we the study that we've commissioned with Analysis Group has predicted it'll be 1 trillion just for APEC. But the reason why we also feel like we should have conversations about this very early, and also with policymakers like IMDA and also academics like Daniel at NUS, is because this will open up a lot of new questions for us as well in the space of trust. And I think it's important we feel that we have these conversations really early on.
Great. So if I could just ask you a follow-up question, Clara, before we move to the others. You said it would raise or kind of throw open a whole bunch of new questions relating to trust. Could you give us a few examples that we could sort of reflect on? And earlier in the morning, we were talking about a number of different dimensions of trust. One obviously has to do with data and what happens to the data and concerns about privacy and so on. Others that have to do with content and the extent to which the content is reliable, credible, authentic, and so on and so forth. Third, you have to do with the fact that much more than just somebody's data is being captured. There's biometric information and so on. So I'm just curious about what are some of the critical areas that you and your team have spotlighted as some of the big question areas for trust.
So there's a lot there, but I think maybe just focus on one piece, which is that data piece. So we talked about all these new inputs that we need to take in for rendering social presence in the metaverse. And so things, for example, the latest in our suite of VR headsets have internal sensors for the first time. It would be taking photographs of your eyes, eye tracking data of your face, so that we can render your avatars in a more lifelike way. Obviously, that means that there is new information that is being collected from people. And when you talk about bringing new technologies into the consumer space, and adoption, people need to feel like they trust, right, this new technology. So I think for us, when we are sort of building these new technologies, and at least just in the VR headset space, with the new inputs that are being captured, it's really important that we have we bear these trust principles in mind. And for us, we have, our set of responsible innovation principles. I think one of them is really don't surprise people. And I think for this, for us in the new headset, these new internal sensors are turned off by default, because you don't want to surprise people that, oh, you're putting on a headset that is by Meta, but not knowing that perhaps this one has internal sensors, so we've left them off. It gives people the option to then turn them on. Things like one other principle is give people controls that actually are meaningful and matter. And so here it's really about then, offering users the chance to give consent to your information being used for the device, both at the systems level in the headset, but also for app developers whom you are interacting and being present in the virtual space. Another principle is really put people at the center of what we're building. And that was one of the key themes that we talked about this morning, that we really need to have people-focused approaches, right, to designing and building technology for trust. And here it's really about, respecting the fact that people don't want a lot of this very sensitive data to just be, collected and retained. And so for us, raw data that is captured in a headset, for example, is deleted. It stays in the headset and is deleted at each session. And all the eye tracking data that is sort of then generated off that you're still given that option, right, to have that passed on or not. So giving people control and really respecting the fact that this is information that is private and insensitive, and making sure that people are not surprised and that they have control at every step of the way.
So thank you so much for that, Clara. It just really helps set the table in terms of us getting a sense of the metaverse and several of the questions that arise, and giving us a bit of a roadmap. So as you see this as a regulator, 𝗦𝗫𝗲𝗏, what are some of the issues that come top of mind, from a policy perspective, from a regulatory perspective?
Thanks for that. I think, of course, with any new technology, emerging technology, there will be new issues that will arise, and then we'll ask ourselves, do existing regulations apply? Do we need to change? And how do we change, especially when these emerging technologies move so fast? And there are also new things that we have to learn. So how do we work with companies? How do we work with academics to understand the issues? And then how do we nimbly address these issues? So I agree with Clara, right? Some of the questions around data, for example, would be consent. Given that there's a huge amount of data that's collected, the increase in scale in terms of the type as well as the amount of data, then how then do we make sure that consumers feel that they are protected in this new world? And then even between businesses, right? How do they share this data in the way that they can then continue to be able to innovate and provide new kind of services in the metaverse to consumers? So one of the questions that we have would be then, how do we go about thinking and addressing these issues? And as I mentioned earlier, how do we nimbly, right, respond to these issues? And one of the things that we are doing, for example, with Meta, is this program that we jointly call Design Jam, where we look at emerging policy issues and how does this apply to organizations when they think about delivery of their apps and their services, right? So Design Jam is a joint program that we have Meta where we've run it for a couple of years already. We looked at explainability and transparency in AI last year. We looked at consent and just-in-time consent a couple of years ago. And this year we're looking at consent and data use in the metaverse, right? Where we want to bring together companies, startups mostly, who are delivering these services. And then they are then able to, with the regulator, understand the issues that they're facing, clarity. As well as then for us, is about prototyping new mechanisms. So for example, we have one of the companies called 𝗏𝗲𝗄, is a AR, VR gaming company. And they are actually very curious to learn how do they get consent, right, from their gamers. How do they create standards in terms of data stewardship, in terms of the amount of data they collect, and then how then do they address some of the questions that they have. Can they collect so much? How do they manage this data and so on? So these are quite a good opportunity for us collectively, right, with the industry and with the regulator to understand the issues. And eventually what we hope when we take these prototypes or these design jams is to then draw the lessons out and then make these lessons or this experience available to every organization or everyone in the ecosystem, right? So that they too can then benefit from the experiences and the lessons. So that's something that we're doing to be able to more quickly learn and understand the issues and be able to more quickly then respond to the needs and then hopefully then make this information useful. So quite upfront, we don't think we need to change existing laws, but we do need to put out a lot more guidance. We do need to work with the industry to develop standards. We do need to provide a lot more information so that everybody can learn together.
That's great. So now we're beginning to get a sense of the outlines of the frontier of this, emerging technology and its applications, and how you're thinking about it from a regulatory perspective and policy perspective, which is great. We are looking around corners, and we've learned from our experience of the past, where the internet just sort of blew open and everybody was blown away, and only exposed after things went wrong. We started retroactively beginning to reflect on what we should have anticipated earlier. So this is a very exciting time to be to actually think 2 steps ahead. But Professor Daniel, as you sort of listen to this conversation, let's just focus on some of the ethical issues that might still get caught between the product and design developers and the policymakers. Where do you see the biggest questions lie, and how might you direct both sides, to sort of think about these issues as we look around corner?
That's a very tough question to answer.
Well, that's why I asked it.
I think, but we have to make a start.
Yeah.
And I think one of the best ways to do this is to start by being totally objective about it. One of the most underappreciated aspects of academic research has been that academia aspires to be as neutral and as objective as possible. which means that we don't take sides in the analysis. And that's why we are very grateful to Meta for sponsoring us by way of a gift, no strings attached, to do this piece of research, because it allows us to come to the issue with a totally fresh perspective, a blank slate. And returning to your question, I think there are a number of big picture and small minutiae issues that we have to tackle. Probably the first is the regulatory approach issue. Because what's legal doesn't mean it's ethical. At the same time, what's ethical does not mean it's legal. So there's an intersection of no man's land, which many developers will be caught because the law is either unclear or the ethical rules are insufficiently specific. We can think of many, many scenarios. So over at Trail, we have had a conference, a Metaverse conference, we called it, which we conducted last month. And one of the interesting things that came from the conference was the fact that we are now able to use existing technology to map up a person's physiological characteristics simply by way of the sensors embedded in current electronic devices. So with a high level accuracy of more than 85% now, it has been shown in our collaboration with our colleagues from the School of Computing that we can figure out the gender of the individual, the approximate age of the individual, probably even the medical characteristics of the individual, depending on the information that sensors can record about the individual. Now, it may be that these sensors have certain features that are disabled, but you can infer using machine learning algorithms what these deleted characteristics are because of the pure power of machine learning. So that's what we're trying to explore in this space in conjunction with our colleagues from the School of Computing. And it gives rise to this big question of what can the law really do in this space to manage, in a sense, the inevitable. We will see companies and businesses harnessing this information for good and for bad. You can't stop people from doing bad things. But we have to do this constructively in a way to minimize the amount of potential harm that this may cause. So efforts like Meta to control the amount of information that could be stored on devices and could be released to third parties is a good first step, which is, of course, the privacy by design principle, which IMDA is very familiar with. But I think we need to go beyond that, because by design presupposes that you have a responsible company doing its best to comply with certain norms and rules. You will inevitably have irresponsible companies who don't follow those rules. So another aspect of this analysis could very well be, and this is what I think we are trying to do with our research as well, is that we may need to plug some of these holes with laws, for instance. And what might some of these laws be? I'm hypothesizing now, and one of these issues that has recently cropped up is this issue related to virtual properties. You get lots of virtual properties, virtual assets being deployed in the metaverse. Somebody comes along and copies a virtual property. I can take your NFT and stick it into my room. All right? Can I grab your coins because I cracked your code and deploy it for some other purposes? So we have to think through a lot of these issues that are coming up because it's really hard to keep up. I'm a technology lawyer for more than 3 decades now, and I'm still keeping up. Every day I'm reading new missives and new technological developments and new techniques in machine learning, and I have trouble keeping up. It's my job to keep up. And every year I tell my dean, I need to change my teaching syllabus because every year I'm teaching new things. And likewise, I think it's also part and parcel of the community, looking at it at large right now, for everyone here to keep up with what's developing around the world. So to take another anecdote, you mentioned, Clara, Meta's avatars having no legs, right? Previously, they had legs. Then the issue was raised about potential issues of harassment, sexual harassment, when the avatars had legs. So the legs were removed. But then the experience has been that avatars without legs don't really look like avatars. So we're going to put the legs back in. So this is to and froing of issues that we see being, I think, part and parcel of this entire discourse of what the issues might be. But I don't think there's any good answer that we can offer this unless, and I'm taking a step forward now, unless we have clear, bright line rules about what you can't do. So one of the things that has often amazed me is how the Europeans have tried to have bright line rules about what you can't do in this space. The most intriguing thing, of course, is in relation to the management of personal data. So sensitive personal information is a do not cross line. And that includes things like religious inclinations, gender, medical history, criminal records, so on and so forth. That's a do not cross line. Another one which you see they are gradually developing is in relation to the EU AI Act, which I'm sure has been discussed at various junctures. So there's some things you can't do with the deployment of AI in certain circumstances, for which if there is harm, there has to be compensation. So moving forward, I think you will get this intersection where the ethical rules are unclear, but you need very clear, bright line, do not cross red line rules to help us guide our progress forward as we move ahead with the technology. I'm sorry that's a very long answer, a very convoluted academic answer to a very difficult question, but it's the start to a discourse, I think.
No, this is really, really very helpful, Professor Daniel. In fact, I'm relieved that avatars are going to have legs, because I believe Nike had already spent quite a bit of money in staking some property out in the metaverse. So I was kind of wondering what Nike was going to do if people walked into the metaverse without legs. So it's a big relief to at least hear that. So I guess a number of different questions popped up as I listened to all of you, and perhaps we'd work in reverse order. 𝗦𝗽𝗲𝗍𝗲, if I could ask you about the whole notion of consent. Today we have an environment where a consent pops up, and the first thing a user wants to do is get that out of the way, right? So now I'm entering the metaverse where presence is, that's the reason why I'm there. And normally when I walk into a room, I don't seek consent, because I'm essentially trying to replicate, this kind of an interaction. So I'm curious about your sense as a public policy and a regulatory person as to how to make this consent process something more than just a box-checking exercise.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And that's why we're working with all these these very interesting startup companies to try and find ways in which they can prototype consent in the experience that they're offering to their users. So is it when you walk into a room in the metaverse and then something pops up? Is it by way of deemed consent if you agree to do something by actually using a certain service? Are there ways in which could an avatar come to you and say, we are planning to do this, and then is that okay? Right? Would that be more palatable to individuals? So there are many different ways that we may have to then figure out how do you get consent. But some of the lessons that we've learned is you cannot give a 10-page terms and condition document and say, click this and then move on, right? Because then that's, to the user, it's irrelevant. And we're not really actually seeking consent, even if he has said yes, right? So you want to be effective, you must find a way to help him understand what he's getting himself into, and then say, yes, I agree to that. So for example, I agree that you can use my data and share it with your partner, right? So that I can get additional services, I can get marketed to, for example, and so on. So I think these are things that we would like to find out. It's a new world out there, new metaverse world. I'm sure there'll be many, many innovative ways in which companies can find to gather consent from their customers. And we look forward to learning, as well as hopefully then providing some level of guidance, right? To say, yeah, this makes sense. And eventually, like I said, be able to then these become a kind of like code of practice that that different organizations, as Clara said, it's not just Meta. I mean, there are many, many companies out there. Different organizations can then draw upon to provide better experience to their customers. Yeah.
So, Professor Daniel, if I could just build on that and ask you the question, as it relates to your background as a technology lawyer, I speak from the outside. My understanding of a lot of legal scholarship is based on understanding precedent and what had happened in the past, and using that as a framework for legal analysis. Now here we're in completely uncharted territory. So as a legal scholar, how do you approach that, and how does that sort of shape your work?
We are entering into this perennial debate about whether the law can be exhaustive or whether it can be complete. I think a way out of this is this jurisprudential quagmire is to say that the law has to always give an answer. Now, once we start with that premise that the law always has to give an answer, then the issue then becomes, where do you find the answer? I think the answer could be found by analogies, and very often the law develops by way of analogies incrementally. But in this day and age of technological development where things happen so fast, for these analogies to be built up, you need to, unfortunately, go to the courts. The courts have to hear the matter, adjudicate on the matter, and then make a ruling, and there could be appeals that go all the way up to the appellate court before there is a final pronouncement on the issue. And to complicate matters, that's a ruling in that jurisdiction, in that country, because some other country may have a different approach to the same matter. So how do we solve this problem? Well, I suppose there are two approaches to this. The first is to try to find some international consensus on the matter, and international consensus is possible. So in 1996, a few years after Al Gore purportedly created or fathered the internet, a lot of the countries in the world gathered together in Geneva, and they put forth the WIPO Copyright Treaty, WIPO Phonograms, and the W Performance Treaty, WPPT. That's all done in a span of 4 years, which is a record by any imagination if you've ever been involved in any kind of international negotiations for transnational treaties. It's a record. So where the political will is there, there will be international consensus, and we can harmonize our laws internationally to arrive at a consensus on that particular point and issue. The other, of course, is, and I see this a lot of AI frameworks, a lot of privacy frameworks, laws being populated around different jurisdictions now. That's another way forward, where the regulator, the government takes an active stand and proposes solutions to these problems. And these are, of course, subject to change. The disadvantage of that is that there is no harmonization at the international level. It's only harmonization at the jurisdictional level. The flip side, of course, is that for companies and businesses, this makes business very difficult because the law is unclear. So the anecdote I'd like to give to people is during those times where, can you imagine, where you could still travel freely, and that was pre-COVID days, I was on an SIA plane, I was still at Changi Airport, and there was a screen that came out and said, SIA follows data protection policies. Would you like to read them? Well, I mean, I was waiting for the plane to take off, and I said, yes, right? I mean, what can I do? Aside from listening to the pilot's announcements, I have absolutely nothing to keep me entertained. So I entertained myself by reading 34 pages of SIA's privacy protection policies regarding what it can do with my information. I believe I may be the only person who has actually read all 34 pages of it, because I was scrolling through it and taking notes along the way, taking pictures with my phone as well to prove a point. To return to your question, harmonization, therefore, cannot be just simply by way of laws. It has to involve some kind of co-relationship with businesses to work together to try to figure out a best practical solution to many of these problems. I mean, how many of us remember all 30, I can't remember all 34 pages of what I read on my SIA flight. I was probably more eager to find out whether they'll give me peanuts, all right? But the point is, there is some assurance when businesses and regulators work together to try to derive common solutions to this problem, that we are moving in the same direction. And by same direction, I mean correct direction, as opposed to some arbitrary direction in which we have no guidance and no expectations, and no protection for whatever the subject matter might be. So I think a forum like this is an excellent chance for the regulators and the industry and the academics to get together and work out solutions to many of these problems, be they hypothetical, be they extremely forward-looking, be they even figments of somebody's imagination. Because I still remember my colleague and I wrote our Metaverse paper. We said, is it possible for an avatar to sexually harass another avatar? We said, nah, it's not possible. But we just put it in anyway because we are academics. We just postulate things. And lo and behold, 2 months later, we found out there was actually an expose on BBC stating that a reporter was sexually harassed when her avatar was assaulted using a haptic suit on an environment. So you can't put it beyond the, as I said, the imagination of bad actors to do bad things in any environment. And that's why we need a lot of cooperation between the regulators, the academics, and the industry to try to make this world a better place.
Yeah, I think, as you said, kind of looking for analogies is probably the way to go. And if the metaverse is as good as it sounds, it will be a replica of what we're doing here in the room. If somebody can sexually harass somebody else in a physical environment like this, surely they can do that in the metaverse as well, except that in the metaverse they could have superpowers, which we may not have here. So there's a lot of leaps of faith one needs to take. But as sort of coming back to Meta itself, which is now in the position of essentially being at the creative edge, imagining what is possible. And as you listen to the lawyers, the regulators, the rule makers, how do you strike a balance between innovation and those who say, wait a minute, let's just stop and think about this, or let's have a consent box here before we innovate any further? I mean, how does the company approach this issue? Because I'm assuming in the past, the rules and the policies and a lot of the laws actually followed once the product was in the field.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think that's why for us at Meta, as we're building towards the metaverse, we feel like it's really important that we start having these conversations really, really early. I think we've learned the lessons of the past, and I think that by spending the time early today to kind of work out some of these issues together with regulators and academics, we're going to build a more sort of sustainable product. It will also, people will trust it more. And I think when we have those pieces together, when you have trust, you call it a lubricant, right, for consumers, and then people will want to use the product. In the same way today, in the sort of 2D world that we have, as a business, we say that safety is key to the business, right? Because if people don't feel safe, on our platforms and services, they are just not going to continue to be, on the platforms or share things and interact with people. And I think in the same way, we just want to make sure that when we're building towards the metaverse, we want those experiences to be, people feel like there is transparency about how their data is being collected and how it's being used. They have opportunity to provide consent at the right points in time. And I think to 𝗦𝗲𝗲's, point, it also opens up a lot of being in the metaverse, and as we're building towards and thinking about these policy questions like consent, and doing it early with people who are building these technologies, there's a lot of innovation that can take place around how do we ask for consent, and how do we, for example, deal with harmful situations, right? Because how we deal about it today in the 2D social media world, for example, harmful content, things are posted and it's static. You can then sort of have moderators review and people sort of like report that piece of content. But when you're in the metaverse, it's going to be real-time interactions between users, right? When we think about content moderation in real time, there are new challenges that we have to think about. We have to also think about new tools that we put in the hands of users so that they can protect themselves in situations. Personal boundaries being one of them that we've done for Horizon Worlds so that people, other avatars can't come too close to you. And so there's a lot of creativity that can happen, even in sort of taking the time to think about these issues at the get-go. And we think that it's really important that we do that, with experts, with policymakers, and obviously also civil society organizations.
So just picking up on the last point about some of these issues happening in real time, we had the horrendous experience of the Christchurch shooting and Facebook Live. There was, I've forgotten how many seconds while it was live, and then it was taken off. I'm assuming, thinking about analogies, there are kind of real-time content moderation that one would have to be on in terms of the metaverse all the time. Is that right? I mean, is that a fair? Because it's kind of like instead of going to a physical space, all kinds of crazy things can happen in this, alternate reality.
So I think in the 2D world today, with live video, there are ways now that the tech companies have sort of worked together to, implement sort of processes to deal with like live events, like what happened in Christchurch, where, there is machine learning that can be applied. There can be in user reporting flows when people are reporting a live video and saying that it's terrorism. There are ways to sort of expedite human review for that type of content, that the kind of digital fingerprints of that type of content can be shared with other technology companies so that they on their platforms can look for that stuff and take it down. So the Christchurch, is kind of like industry coming together after a really horrible crisis, but learning from it and working together and now be more effective and efficient, I think, in removing and dealing with these types of content and situations. Of course, the metaverse is going to be different. I think having sort of like live moderation might not be possible. But, it's a challenge that we should put our heads together to think about. Today, what we have available for people is that, when you report someone or something happening in the metaverse, it's a video recording of that moment in time that can then be reviewed and penalties can be applied once that piece of video is reviewed and we feel that is appropriate and violates the community standards. But, again, we're at the very beginning. We haven't seen sort of like the full manifestations of what this will bring in terms of like interactions between people in the metaverse. But yeah, again, we don't want another Christchurch where something really horrible sort of happens and then we come together. But again, like having early conversations early, having people who are outside of the industry telling us like, hey, have you thought about this? Helps us to then think better and maybe prepare better.
So we have hit the magic 0.00 number. So very quickly, a lightning round set of questions that has to do with the location of Singapore. What's unique about this location that can help shed light on how we build trust in the metaverse? And I know that question could go in all sorts of directions, but I'm just curious about one thought that you can leave us with, each one of you. Who would like to go first? Perhaps, Clara, you could start us off and then we go to the others.
I mean, the fact that we're having this conference and having sort of just on this sort of stage right now, industry, academia, and sort of the regulators sitting together and talking about ways we can work together to innovate sort of safely for the future, I think is one of the strong points about Singapore and why a lot of businesses, want to be here.
Okay, I can add on to that. I agree absolutely with Clara. I think the fact that we are working together, I mean, Singapore is quite unique. The privacy or data protection regulator is very open to working with companies to try and learn and adapt and find new solutions. But I think maybe just to add on to that as well, Singapore has built up a reputation of trust. I think it's just from years and years where, we are straight talkers, we say what we do, we can be trusted, we follow the law, and things like that. So I think that's also a good foundation for us to then to have these conversations on digital trust, on identifying new ways in which we can create more digital trust in the metaverse. Yeah.
Great.
I see ourselves as being at the crossroads of the East and the West. So we try to learn from the best from both approaches. At the same time, we bring to bear our multidisciplinary approach to many of these issues. This issue cannot be tackled by law alone, nor can it be tackled by technology alone. It needs a lot of informed minds putting their heads together in a totally informed and objective environment to work out the best solutions. So I think this is what we're best at.
Great, that's fantastic. It's a great place to bring this to a close. I must say that it's incredibly refreshing to have this kind of a discussion on this stage here. Where I come from, the United States, Meta and a regulator would not be seen on the same stage almost unless the regulator is wagging their finger at Meta and asking, how they make money. And the response usually is, we sell ads, Senator. So it's wonderful to see this kind of collaboration, and hopefully that spirit moves westward. So thank you so much.